They cut his mic in under 11 seconds. In the middle of a live Senate hearing, as J.D. Vance began to speak, not shout, not accuse, just speak, they pulled the cord. Cameras kept rolling. The room fell into a strange, cold silence. No gavel, no warning, just silence. But what happened next wasn't silence. It was a shock wave. Because J.D. didn't pause, he didn't flinch. He reached into a leather folder, and what he revealed wasn't just a file. It was the one thing Kamala Harris and her team never expected to see in public. A document so buried, so inconvenient, that some say it was never meant to exist. And yet, within 24 hours, over 7 million Americans had watched his response. Not from C-SPAN, from their phones, their kitchens, their union halls, from towns that never get mentioned in press briefings. This is the story of the moment they tried to mute a man and accidentally gave him the loudest mic in the nation. What you're about to hear didn't happen exactly this way, but the feeling, the silence, the tension, the need to be heard, that part is real. This is a dramatized story inspired by public figures and real debates, told through the lens of imagination. Names are familiar. Details are fictional. But if it makes you feel something, maybe that's the truest part of all. Now ask yourself, what happens when the people you're trying to silence are finally listening? Stay with us. What you're about to witness isn't just a story, it's a turning point. Washington, D.C., 9:02 a.m. The Senate Subcommittee on Emerging Technologies wasn't usually a place for fireworks, but today every seat in the chamber was taken, and the hallway outside looked more like a press junket than a policy hearing. The murmur of early chatter had faded into a sharp, waiting silence, the kind that settles right before a storm. Aide after aide moved briskly, positioning folders, adjusting microphones, scanning the room for vulnerabilities. Security stood tighter than usual, each one briefed that this hearing had national implications. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. This wasn't just about tech, it was about control. And then she arrived. Senator Kamala Harris swept in through the East Side entrance, flanked by 2 senior advisors and a younger woman holding a digital notepad. Harris wore a muted navy blazer, but nothing about her presence was muted. Her heels echoed like punctuation on the marble floor. Her posture was rigid, eyes fixed forward, not greeting anyone, not nodding, not smiling. Her team split formation as they approached the dais. One whispered something into the earpiece of a Capitol technician. Another handed Harris a single printed sheet. She didn't look at it. She already knew what was on it. Her seat, center left of the semicircular arrangement, had been elevated just slightly, a subtle visual cue. Her nameplate gleamed. The press focused their lenses on her as she settled in, brushed a strand of hair behind one ear, and gave a small nod as if to say, "I'm ready to run this." Cameras flashed, recorders rolled, but the energy in the room still felt incomplete because the final witness hadn't arrived. There was a slight delay, 30 seconds, maybe less, but it was enough for people to shift, glance around, whisper. The chair cleared his throat. A news anchor outside muttered into his mic, "Still waiting on the senator from Ohio." And then the back door creaked open. J.D. Vance stepped in, not flanked, not guarded, not smiling. Just him. He wore a simple gray suit, a half-wrinkled shirt without a tie, and in one hand, he held a weathered leather folder, the edges cracked from use. In the other, a small black pouch, zipped tightly, no logos. No staff trailed him. No one announced his name. But the room shifted. Cameras pivoted. Harris's eyes narrowed, not in shock, but in calculation. J.D. walked slowly, as if letting each footstep feel the gravity of the room. When he reached his seat, he didn't look at the chair. He didn't look at the press. He simply set the pouch on the desk, placed the leather folder on top, and stared at the microphone in front of him. Quiet, still. The contrast between them was impossible to ignore. Harris radiated choreography, command, stagecraft. J.D. radiated something else, something that didn't need to be polished to be powerful. A stillness that said, "You built this stage. I came to break it." The lights above flickered once, only for a second, but enough to make 3 staffers glance up. A buzzing sound, faint, came from one of the overhead speakers. The room technician tapped his tablet, confused. JD didn't move, but he noticed. And in that tiny moment, a reporter in the 3rd row scribbled a single sentence. "There's something in that folder." Next to it, she drew a question mark. From across the table, Kamala Harris adjusted her posture and leaned slightly forward, her voice low enough to avoid a microphone. Let's not give him time to build momentum. But it was already too late. The air had changed. It no longer felt like a policy hearing. It felt like a fuse had just been lit, and everyone was pretending not to notice the smell of smoke. J.D. Vance leaned into the microphone, not with force, not with flair, but with the kind of quiet certainty that made people lean in without realizing it. He began not with statistics, but with a name. Mason Hill, population 3,612, or 3,127 now, depending on which factory closed last. His voice was steady, almost too calm for the gravity of what he was about to say. He didn't read from notes. He didn't need to. I'm not here to talk about AI innovation from the lens of venture capital, he said. I'm here to talk about what it means when your child's face is fed into a predictive algorithm without your permission, and the company that did it triples its stock price while your town loses its only grocery store. A few eyebrows lifted. Staffers exchanged glances. Kamala didn't. Her fingers tapped in slow rhythm on the table. JD continued. We talk about emerging technologies like they're born clean, but they're built on something, on data, our data. And when that data is extracted from working-class Americans and sold to the highest bidder, it's not innovation, it's exploitation. A murmur spread across the press row. He went on, each sentence striking a different note. Economic loss, medical privacy, military veterans being tracked without consent. A father in Kentucky whose son's health records were used to train a corporate model. A teacher in Iowa who had to quit after A. I flagged her lesson plan as sensitive. No shouting, no theatrics. Just a slow rising pressure. A kind of truth that didn't knock. It seeped under the door. That's when Kamala Harris moved. Her chair slid back ever so slightly. She raised her hand, not to ask a question, but to take the floor. Mr. Vance, she said, her tone clipped. With all due respect, this subcommittee is convened to discuss regulation strategy, not campaign-style grievances. JD looked at her, unreadable. Kamala didn't wait. You're off topic. You're inflaming. And this is not the floor for anecdotal populism. She turned slightly to the chairman, lifting her brow. Mr. Chair? The chairman, older, unsure, looked between them, then gave a hesitant nod. JD's mic went silent. Just like that. For 5 seconds, the room held its breath. No one moved. The press stopped typing. Even the floor lights seemed to dim, as if the moment itself refused to continue. It wasn't just the sound that was gone. It was the rightness of sound. The expectation that someone had the right to finish a sentence before it was erased. J.D. Vance did not flinch. He looked at the darkened mic, and then at Kamala. No reaction, no anger, no smirk. He simply reached, calmly, deliberately, into the small black pouch he had placed beside his folder. The zipper's sound was barely audible, but in the tense stillness of the chamber, it felt deafening. He pulled out a lapel mic, old but well-maintained, and a small transmitter. Wireless, independent. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He clipped it to his collar. Set the transmitter by his folder. Then slowly he tapped his phone, checked the signal, and placed it on the desk, screen facing up. A red light blinked. Live. Kamala's eyes narrowed. The chairman looked confused. And somewhere in the back of the room, a capital aide whispered to no one in particular, Is he live streaming? No one answered, because no one knew what to say. J.D. sat upright, silent, waiting. The room had tried to shut him down, but somehow he now felt louder than ever, and he hadn't even spoken yet. The red light blinked once, then held steady. J.D. didn't speak immediately. He looked down at the phone as if confirming something only he could see. The screen showed the interface of a decentralized video stream, No filters, no edits, no government backdoor. In the lower right corner, the viewer count ticked upward like a slow fuse. 83,217. He adjusted the lapel mic just slightly, eyes locked on the lens, embedded in the corner of his phone. Not on the committee, not on the chair, not even on Kamala Harris. He was no longer speaking to the room. He was speaking to everyone they'd left out of it. Then, without raising his voice, he said, "If Washington won't hear me, maybe the people still can." It wasn't a shout. It was something far more dangerous. Calm defiance. A statement not just of intent, but of audience realignment. For the first time in the hearing, Kamala blinked. The room didn't know whether to stop him or to pretend it wasn't happening. A Capitol IT staffer near the back began typing furiously into a tablet, whispering into his headset. "We've got a rogue broadcast from inside the chamber. I repeat, unauthorized signal live from Vance's desk." The feed technician on the other end asked, "Can we trace it?" The staffer glanced up. "No, it's private mesh. It's not even running through our network." The live stream counter surged. 91,040, 97,522. JD leaned forward. "They told me I'd be given 5 minutes. What they didn't tell me was how fast they'd try to erase them." A slight intake of breath rippled from the gallery. "They said this hearing was about emerging technology. So let's talk about what's really emerging. Mass data extraction, consent bypassing, surveillance disguised as service, and policy written not by the public, but by the platforms." The feed soared, 104,000, then 118,000. Kamala shifted in her seat, trying not to show the tightness gathering behind her jaw. Her chief of staff whispered something quickly in her ear. She didn't respond. Her focus was fixed, sharp and unwavering on JD. Meanwhile, Vance's voice, steady and deliberate, continued to fill the space they thought they had muted. "I've driven past schools in my state that no longer have math textbooks because those budgets were diverted to pilot AI programs written in California." He paused. "I've sat with mothers who've lost their health coverage because an algorithm said their zip code was statistically too risky." He looked up again, and for the first time, he locked eyes with Kamala. "You want to call that progress? I call it abandonment at scale." On the phone screen, the comments flooded in. "Watching from West Virginia. Tell it like it is. Finally, someone says it." A donation button quietly embedded by JD's team in advance began to glow. JD didn't touch it. He didn't need to, because the number on screen had just passed 125,400 and showed no signs of slowing. C-SPAN was still live, of course, but their angle showed only Kamala Harris staring ahead with a calculated stillness that betrayed the tension now sitting just beneath her skin. The committee room, once the center of the conversation, was no longer in control of the conversation. A few rows back, the same journalist who had written, "There's something in that folder," now scribbled a second line under it. "This isn't a hearing anymore. It's a handoff." And just like that, it was clear. The mic wasn't cut. It had only changed hands. JD Vance didn't rush. He let the silence settle again, not as a pause, but as punctuation, a deliberate space before what he knew would land heavier than anything he'd said so far. "There's a woman named Lillian Baird," he began, his voice low but unwavering. 83 years old, lives in East Palestine, Ohio. Or at least, she did. Somewhere across the live stream in thousands of living rooms and phone screens, that name hung in the air. Lillian, a name that could be your mother's. Or your grandmother's, JD continued. "She ran a small upholstery shop for 40 years, kept every receipt by hand, didn't even own a smartphone until 2 years ago. She downloaded one healthcare app to track her blood pressure because her doctor was required to recommend it." He paused. "That app shared her data with a third-party AI model. That model flagged her as a high-risk patient, and her insurance premiums tripled overnight." In the chamber, no one moved. On the live stream, the viewer count surged past 130,000. "She called the company," JD said. "They told her it was an algorithmic adjustment, not a mistake. Nothing personal, just pattern recognition. She sold her shop to cover the bills, declared bankruptcy 6 months later. Now she lives in a converted storage unit behind her niece's house." He looked up at the camera, not just with anger, but with a quiet sorrow sharpened by purpose. You want to talk about emerging technology? That's it, right there. A grandmother bankrupt because her heartbeat became someone else's business model. And then, for the first time in the live stream, JD named names. The lobbying firm that helped push this AI-driven underwriting is called Marlowe Strategies. You won't find them in the news, but they wrote the white paper that got passed, nearly word for word, into the federal guidelines for algorithmic healthcare pricing. They're backed by three major tech companies. One of them testified in front of this very committee last spring. He didn't look at Kamala when he said it. He didn't have to. The press did it for him. As JD's voice carried through the live feed, the screen briefly cut to B-roll his team had preloaded. Quiet, unspoken images that said everything no speech could. An abandoned steel plant in East Palestine, its windows shattered, weeds cracking through the concrete floor. A school playground with rusted swing sets and no children in sight. A row of houses with for sale signs long since faded by sun and wind. Then, most devastating, a veteran in his late 60s, alone in a plastic lawn chair, staring at a mailbox that hadn't held anything but past due notices in weeks. A headline below the image read, AI loan scoring. Why 9 counties in Ohio lost credit access in 2023. Back in the room, a shift rippled through the audience. Not dramatic, but deep. A recognition that this wasn't just political theater. This was a map of impact. This isn't an anti-tech speech, JD said, turning back to camera. It's an anti-amnesia speech. We forgot that progress, if it forgets people, isn't progress at all. It's abandonment with better branding. At the press table, fingers typed frantically. On the live stream, one viewer comment hovered near the top. He's not raising his voice, but I've never felt more heard. And somewhere, on a screen that hadn't shown emotion in decades, Kamala Harris blinked. Kamala Harris leaned slightly toward her aide, never taking her eyes off JD. Her lips barely moved. "Cut the live stream," she whispered. The aide, young and sharp in a tailored gray suit, tapped rapidly on his tablet. He whispered back, "We can't. It's not going through any congressional Wi-Fi. It's bouncing off a private 5G mesh. Looks like he's using satellite redundancy." Kamala's jaw locked. "Shut it down anyway." The aide tried. 2 more taps. Nothing. He glanced up, alarmed, and shook his head just once. JD hadn't stopped talking, but now he shifted. He knew. "They built firewalls," he said, pausing just enough for people to lean in. "I built a tunnel." The line dropped like thunder in a vacuum. No one dared cough. Not a single camera clicked. Even the chair, who had started to lift a hand in procedural protest, slowly lowered it again. JD didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply pressed forward. This country was built on the idea that no man should speak only if permitted. Today, we test whether that idea still matters. Across the live stream, the viewer count passed 168,000. Comments flew faster than the platform could pin them. And in the lower left corner, one thing stood out. Hashtag "They Muted Vance" was now trending. Top 5 in the US. A few rows back, a Capitol tech advisor, assigned to monitor real-time network behavior, spoke softly into a secure line. He's live on at least 3 mirrored streams, BitTunnel, EchoCast, and something peer-to-peer. They're syncing through an off-grid repeater node. "We don't have authority to access that." The response came back. "He's out of reach?" "Yes, ma'am, completely." In the hearing room, JD set down his phone flat on the desk. It continued blinking red, steady and strong, like a heartbeat that couldn't be stopped. His leather folder remained untouched. Whatever was inside, he hadn't needed it. Yet. Kamala's fingers curled slightly, nails pressing into her palm. She didn't speak, but her silence said more than any objection could. The stage she had prepared was slipping from her control. Not to chaos, but to something worse. A narrative she didn't own. JD continued, his voice even, his tempo precise. "I was told I'd be allowed 5 minutes to speak. They cut me off at 3, so I gave the other 2 minutes back, to the people who paid for this building." Behind him, the mural of the Capitol dome gleamed under halogen lights, but for once, no one looked at it. All eyes were on the man who had just exposed a system's fragility with a calm sentence and a blinking red dot. At a news desk in Atlanta, an anchor looked directly into the camera. We are now watching the first congressional testimony broadcast independently, outside government infrastructure, in real time. This has never happened before. Not like this. In a union hall in Akron, workers crowded around a mounted screen above the vending machines. Jaws tight, faces solemn. One of them muttered, "He brought his own mic." And they still couldn't silence him. In the chamber, the silence was total. JD let it breathe. He didn't rush to fill the space. He understood the value of letting weight hang in the air. He'd seen too many polished statements get ignored. But when you speak plainly, without permission, that's when people start listening. And somewhere in the chaos of digital feeds and trending hashtags, a single comment stood out above the noise. They cut his mic, but not his message. It started with a flicker. Just one senator, mid-50s, 2 terms deep, not particularly loyal to JD, glanced down at his phone. Then another, younger, progressive-leaning, who normally rolled her eyes at populist speeches, followed suit. The glow from their screens lit their faces faintly, but the looks they exchanged weren't faint at all. Kamala noticed. She adjusted her posture, subtle but deliberate. Her team saw it too. The air had changed. On JD's phone screen, the viewer count ticked upward like it was chasing a runaway train. 973,000, 1.1 million, 1.26 million, and climbing faster with every breath. The hashtag they muted Vance now stood just beneath a viral celebrity scandal, and rising. But JD didn't look at the screen. He looked at the people, not the cameras, not the headlines, the room. He paused mid-sentence, then reached quietly for his folder. The old leather creaked slightly as it opened. From within, he pulled out something small, not a document, not a chart, but a worn, folded piece of lined paper. Its corners were soft. Its ink had slightly bled into the fibers. He unfolded it slowly and held it in one hand. "I want to read something," he said. "It's not from a think tank. It's not from a CEO. It's from a man named Ronnie Kilgore, a steelworker from Hamilton, Ohio." JD's voice, steady as ever, carried now with something more. Weight, yes, but also care. "He handed this to me last fall after a town hall. Didn't say much, just pressed it into my hand and walked away." He looked at the letter. It says, "They shut my mill, then they shut my voice. Don't let them shut you." He paused. The room didn't move. Ronnie worked 28 years at a mill that got replaced by an automated logistics facility. That's the phrase they used in the press release. He doesn't have Twitter. He doesn't have a mic. But today, his voice is here. JD folded the letter and placed it gently on the desk beside his phone. No flourish, no drama, just quiet respect. And that silence, it wasn't political anymore. It was personal. On the live stream, the viewer count passed 1.4 million. The chat slowed, not because people weren't typing, but because more and more viewers stopped to listen, to feel. In the press row, a journalist who had once called JD overproduced populism stopped writing and simply watched. Another, who hadn't quoted him in over a year, began sketching a headline. "The moment JD Vance spoke for the people who stopped being heard." Across the chamber, an older senator who'd privately mocked JD as too Rust Belt for relevance cleared his throat, leaned back, and crossed his arms. But not out of dismissal. He was thinking. Hard. Kamala, meanwhile, kept her eyes trained forward, though her fingers now tapped just a beat faster against her stylus. She could feel it too. The shift. The room was no longer waiting to correct JD. It was waiting to hear him. JD continued, not louder, but closer somehow. This hearing was supposed to be about frameworks and forecasts. But let's not forget who pays the price for every shiny new line of code. It's not the algorithm's designer. It's the man who can't feed his family because a machine does now what he once did with pride. He didn't preach. He didn't accuse. He just stood in it, with them, not above them. And as he reached for a small water bottle, the red live stream light still blinking, the nation kept watching. Not out of outrage anymore, but out of something deeper. Recognition. JD let the moment breathe. The room was listening now, not politely, not politically, but with the still, uneasy quiet of people who sensed something irreversible was coming. He reached for the old leather folder. No theatrics, no flourish. Just a quiet, practiced motion, as though he had opened it hundreds of times before, but only now decided the world was ready to see what was inside. Out came a sealed brown envelope, thick and unmarked, except for one detail. A single strip of red wax, cracked slightly along the seal. JD held it gently, like something fragile. For a brief second, the red wax caught the overhead lights, and a ripple of tension moved through the room. He broke the seal without a word. JD unfolded the papers carefully, then held up the front page so that the camera could see it clearly. The title, typed in bold black ink, filled the frame for a moment on every live stream screen across the country. Managing Vance's media reach, mitigation strategies for Q3 to Q4 exposure. JD placed it on the desk, his hand flat atop the page. This document, he said, voice measured, was written by Baxter Hill Strategies, a Washington-based PR and influence firm contracted by multiple lobbying groups, some of which testified in this chamber last year. He looked toward the committee, not accusing, but not blinking either. The memo outlines a plan to monitor and limit my public exposure across regional news outlets, digital platforms, and direct-to-voter video content. It includes a list of recommended counter-narratives, preferred surrogates for media response, and, in bold font, a section titled Strategic Alliances Within Senate Leadership. Now the press leaned forward. The typing resumed. Aides looked nervously at one another. JD flipped the page. Kamala Harris is mentioned twice, once in a bullet point about pre-coordination for committee interruption, and once in a summary of talking points related to national security optics. He paused. This document is dated 6 months ago. A pin could have dropped. Kamala didn't speak. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. Not enough for the cameras, but enough for anyone watching closely. Her aide shifted in his chair, lips parted as if to whisper, but held back. JD didn't gloat. He simply placed the memo down beside the letter from the steelworker. The contrast sharp. One written in desperation, the other in cold calculation. He looked back at the camera, then at the chair. I bring this not to point fingers, but to shine a light, JD said. If I'm being preemptively targeted for speaking about real people in real towns, then we have to ask, what exactly are we protecting here? Truth or control? In the gallery, someone finally moved. A journalist from a national outlet who had previously ignored Vance's hearings. She turned to her producer and whispered, "We need to clip this. Now." Across the live stream, the count surged again, 1.7 million. But JD didn't react. He sat steady, pages still open before him, as if the next move wasn't his to make. And maybe for the first time, it wasn't. Maybe now it was everyone else who had to decide what to do with what they'd just seen. JD didn't move at first. The strategy memo still lay open beside him, the ink only half dried from its first exposure to daylight. But the air had changed. The room wasn't tense anymore. It was motionless, like the moment before thunder arrives. JD reached into the side pocket of his folder, pulling out a small black device. It was simple. No screen, just one button and a headphone jack. He placed it carefully next to his phone and said into the live stream, "I want to let you hear something." No one interrupted. No one dared. JD tapped the play button. The audio came through not from the room's sound system, but through the live stream feed directly. Those inside the chamber could barely hear it, but those watching online heard it in chilling clarity, crisp, cold, and captured from a meeting no one outside that room was ever supposed to hear. "If we don't silence him, we amplify him. Take the mic." A pause in the clip, a rustle of papers, another voice less certain. "But won't that look too coordinated?" Then the first voice again. "It doesn't matter how it looks. It matters that he stops." That was all. 11 seconds. And yet it detonated like a controlled charge under the floorboards of the Capitol. In the chamber, Kamala Harris didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her body had already answered. A subtle but unmistakable shift. Her shoulders went rigid. Her eyes didn't blink. For the first time since JD began speaking, she looked not like a senator overseeing a hearing, but like someone watching something fall apart from beneath their feet. The rest of the room froze. The chair squinted as if not trusting his own hearing. A tech aide at the back stood up but remained motionless. A journalist lowered her pen mid-word. There was no rebuttal, no procedural objection, no call for order, just silence. Outside the chamber, however, the opposite was happening. Across the country, the clip was already being extracted, shared, clipped, reposted. In less than 90 seconds, "Take the mic" had become a trending phrase on 6 platforms. Viewership surged 2.9 million, 3.1, 3.2 million. Inside the hearing, JD remained still. "I was told transparency was a shared goal," he said, eyes locked on the committee. "That was before I found this recording." He didn't say where he got it. He didn't need to. That wasn't the question anymore. The real question hung silently between Kamala and the rest of the room like smoke in a sealed chamber. Who else was in the room when that recording was made? Kamala's aide leaned in, whispering urgently. She didn't respond. Her fingers pressed tightly against the table's edge, as if anchoring herself to something solid. JD turned back to the camera, voice steady. "Let me be clear. I'm not asking for anyone to agree with me. I'm asking whether we still believe people deserve to speak, even when it's inconvenient, even when it doesn't fit the script." No one interrupted. The committee, for once, didn't even pretend to be in control. And across the country, in kitchens, classrooms, and barbershops, the same clip played on repeat. "If we don't silence him, we amplify him. Take the mic." It didn't sound like politics anymore. It sounded like something older, something colder, like fear. For nearly 30 seconds, no one moved. The committee chamber had become a monument to stillness, one polished, silent room full of men and women trained to respond instantly. And yet now they hesitated, paralyzed not by fear, but by calculation. There was no protocol for this. Kamala Harris still hadn't spoken. She stared ahead, jaw tight, one thumb tracing the side of her stylus in slow mechanical rhythm. Then it came, not from her, not from the podium, not from an official statement, but from a screen in someone's hand. A tweet from a junior staffer. It read, "This clip is real." I was in the room. I quit the next morning. Beneath it, a timestamp, a blurred image of the same conference table from the audio, and a second line. "You weren't supposed to hear it, but you need to." It took just 3 minutes for the tweet to cross 100,000 shares, and in that moment, denial cracked. JD didn't smile. He didn't shift in his chair. But for the first time since the beginning of the hearing, he leaned in. Just slightly, deliberately. His voice remained even, but there was now a weight behind it, like a man pushing a door open that had been locked for years. "You don't have to agree with me," he said, eyes trained on the camera, not the senators. "But you deserve to decide for yourself, without edits, without handlers, without someone flipping your mic switch when the answer doesn't match the question." At that moment, the hearing chamber was no longer the center of the story. It was just the source. Because outside, the real conversation had detonated. On X, screenshots from the memo appeared alongside JD's face. People highlighted Kamala's name circled in red, paired with the phrase, "Committee Interruption Coordination." Reddit threads dissected the audio waveform, matched it to known voices. TikTok videos spliced JD's calm words with split screens of real footage from shuttered factories in empty playgrounds. One caption read, "This isn't testimony, it's a warning." And then came the phrase that no one expected, but that always arrives when momentum shifts. "I don't even like JD Vance, but," followed by, "This isn't about party anymore. This is about who controls the off switch." In the committee room, a senator from Colorado opened her phone under the desk. Her aide showed her something. Her eyes widened, and she closed the screen slowly. She wasn't a Vance ally, not politically, not personally, but something had changed. She now understood. This was not a normal moment. Kamala's lead aide leaned in again. "We should issue a clarification before this spreads any further." But Kamala didn't answer. She couldn't, because it already had. The live stream surged past 3.6 million. Online chat counters slowed, not from lack of messages, but because the platforms couldn't keep up. JD, still seated, let the silence breathe one more time. Truth, he said quietly, should never need permission. But if it does, then it's not truth anymore. It's theater. No one in the chamber argued, because by now it wasn't about who was right. It was about who had already been heard. And outside the room, something even stronger than controversy had begun to form. A movement. The statement came at 4:12 p.m., 2 hours after J.D. Vance had finished speaking, and just under 1 hour after the whistleblower tweet had crossed its 3rd millionth view. From the official press account of the office of Senator Kamala Harris, the message was brief, sterile, and conspicuously devoid of accountability. The recently circulated audio clip has been selectively presented. Context was lost. The senator remains committed to open discourse, integrity, and responsible innovation. It didn't land like a defense. It landed like a strategy meeting held too late. Within 15 minutes, #context was lost began trending, but not in her favor. Screenshots of the memo were reposted beside the quote, captioned sarcastically, "Context was lost or just exposed," and then the second shoe dropped. A second whistleblower, anonymous but verified through encrypted communications with the Washington Ledger, stepped forward, confirming the voice on the tape and backing up the staffer's tweet. In the message to the outlet's investigative desk, the whistleblower wrote, "There was a meeting, there was a plan, and it was never supposed to reach daylight." JD didn't break the rules, he broke the silence. The Ledger, long known for its guarded neutrality, ran the piece under the headline, "Confirmed, audio clip matches internal meeting records." Within an hour, the New York Globe and American Current followed suit. Then the evening anchors weighed in. From across networks and partisan lines, a single truth began surfacing like a buoy under pressure. This was no longer just a hearing. On WorldPoint tonight, lead anchor Jackson Gray opened the broadcast not with foreign policy or economic data, but with J.D. Vance's face. Tonight, what began as a procedural subcommittee hearing has cracked into something much larger. Allegations of coordinated suppression, whistleblowers, internal memos, and an unfiltered voice cutting through the noise. We have not seen a moment like this in over a decade. Clips from JD's live stream played side by side with commentary. His quote about truth not needing permission, the audio bomb, and the now iconic moment where he laid the steelworker's letter beside the memo. But it wasn't just media coverage that shifted. Capitol Hill felt it too. By 6:30 p.m., 3 senators had issued their own brief statements, not to defend Kamala, not to endorse JD, but to call for a formal review of conduct surrounding the committee's proceedings. 2 stopped short of naming names. 1 did not. Senator Howard Eames of Michigan, an independent with little political love for either Harris or Vance, tweeted bluntly, "What we heard today can't be unheard. We need transparency from everyone." Inside Harris's office, the mood was no longer combative. It was cautious. Staffers spoke in half whispers. The press secretary reread the issued statement 3 times, each time asking, "Do we soften the tone or double down?" No one answered. Kamala remained in her private office. Lights dimmed, blinds closed. She hadn't spoken publicly since the clip aired. She hadn't spoken much privately either. Across the city, J.D. Vance sat alone in a quiet room above a diner, the same leather folder closed again in front of him. He wasn't online. He wasn't speaking to reporters. He didn't need to, because in less than 8 hours, the country had started speaking for him. It happened just after 8 p.m., during a live broadcast of Capitol View, a primetime segment known more for its scripted panels than spontaneous drama. Sitting at the center of the table, flanked by pundits and policy analysts, was Lauren Crest, Kamala Harris's longtime communications chief. She looked exhausted. Her blazer was crisp, but her eyes betrayed the 12 hours she'd spent trying to manage a story that refused to be managed. The host, a sharp-jawed moderator who usually gave guests soft landings, turned to her with a question he already knew would hit harder than it appeared. "Lauren, can you confirm whether Senator Harris was aware of the memo detailing efforts to limit J.D. Vance's public visibility before the hearing?" Lauren blinked twice, swallowed hard, and reached for her water. Then she said it, not defensively, not defiantly, just honestly. I believe in transparency. I believe in what we tried to build. But today, I also believe I can no longer be part of something that defends silence as strategy." She paused. "I'm resigning, effective immediately." The panel froze. The host blinked. Someone off camera whispered, "Did she just—" But Lauren Kress didn't wait for questions. She removed her mic, stood slowly, and walked off set, live, unedited, without apology. Within 15 minutes, the clip had been reposted more than 1.2 million times. On J.D. Vance's feed, it played on loop beneath the trending caption, "The silence is breaking." But that wasn't the end. Not even close. By 9:30 p.m., another fault line cracked open. This time, from outside the political bubble. A mid-level tech executive, formerly employed by one of the firms mentioned in the leaked memo, released a cache of internal emails to the independent watchdog site Civic Signal. The messages, dated between March and July, showed clear discussions between policy teams, public relations consultants, and unnamed government liaisons. Subject lines included Vance talking points, March counter strategy, preemptive control of unauthorized testimony, partner coordination, subcommittee disruption. The emails didn't just confirm collusion, they exposed coordination between private firms and political advisors, communications that suggested a deliberate attempt to mute public figures who disrupted consensus narratives. One line buried in an April thread stood out. "If we wait until he goes viral, we've already lost the narrative." Civic Signal published everything in a single, searchable database. Within an hour, over 400,000 users had accessed it. Back in a quiet room across town, J.D. Vance wasn't celebrating. He wasn't retweeting. He wasn't on camera smiling. He was still speaking, but not about the resignations, not about the emails. Instead, he was reading a letter from a 19-year-old trade school student in Indiana. The boy wrote about losing faith in government, about working 2 jobs, about watching his dad get laid off by a company that automated loyalty out of existence. He ended the note with 6 simple words. "Thanks for not talking down to us." JD folded the letter and looked into the live stream camera. "I'm not here to tear people down," he said. "I'm here to ask why the people who build this country are so often the ones being told to keep quiet." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to, because outside the room, in homes and schools and shops across America, more people were realizing what this moment had become. Not just a reckoning, a realignment. The Capitol was asleep, but the country wasn't. It was nearly midnight when J.D. Vance stepped back in front of the live stream. No podium, no committee table, no press. Just a plain desk, a soft desk lamp, and the same folder he'd carried since morning. The background was nothing. A nondescript room, beige walls, an unplugged printer in the corner, but his voice carried farther than ever. He looked tired, not disheveled, not defeated, just human. The kind of tired that comes after telling the truth for 10 hours straight. He leaned forward, rested his elbows on the desk, and opened the folder one last time. "There's one more letter I want to read," he said, the mic catching a trace of wear in his voice. "It's from someone who doesn't have a platform, doesn't have a feed, just 40 years of work and no place left to send the questions that haunt him." He held up a handwritten page, creased at the center, corners slightly oily from use. It had clearly been folded, unfolded, and held more than once. "It's from Frank Hollis," JD continued, "a veteran. 38 years at the same manufacturing plant in Elyria, Ohio. The same one that shut down 4 months after a trade adjustment policy passed, a policy endorsed and co-sponsored by Senator Harris." There was no malice in his tone, only weight. JD began to read. "I served in 2 wars. I don't talk about that much. What broke me wasn't combat. It was standing outside the gates of the plant I gave half my life to, watching the locks go on and the trucks drive out, loaded with equipment labeled for export." He paused for a breath, then continued. "I don't blame anyone for chasing progress. But progress shouldn't leave people like garbage on the loading dock. I'm not writing to complain. I'm writing because I heard you speak once. Not loud, but steady. You didn't talk down to us. You didn't make it about you." JD looked up briefly, then returned to the letter. "So here's my request. Don't shout louder. Just keep standing. That was the last line. JD folded the letter slowly and placed it on the desk in front of him. He didn't speak. He didn't move. The camera held on him for several long seconds. No graphics, no overlays, just a close-up of his eyes. Red-rimmed, weary, but clear, and unshaken. Across the live stream, the comments slowed to a near standstill. People weren't typing. They were listening. Letting the silence settle. Letting the letter settle. In a town outside Columbus, an auto worker watching from his kitchen table whispered to no one in particular, "That sounds like my dad." In Phoenix, a grandmother texted her daughter, "You need to hear this man. He's not yelling, but he's saying everything." And in the Capitol, behind a closed door, Kamala Harris sat alone with the lights off, watching the feed in silence. JD finally spoke again. "I didn't come here to win anything," he said quietly. "Not points, not airtime, just the space to speak and to make room for those who've been pushed out of it for far too long." The red light on his mic continued to glow. Outside, the country listened, and for the first time in a long time, they felt like someone was still standing. It was third period at Lincoln Ridge Middle School, a plain brick building tucked behind a gas station in a cornfield in southern Indiana. The overhead lights buzzed softly, a ceiling fan spun unevenly, and the smell of old textbooks hung in the air like memory. Inside room 203, Mr. Hal Whitman, 42, civics teacher, ex-Marine, father of two, stood at the front of the classroom with his remote in one hand and a pause hanging between his words. The students, mostly eighth graders, were used to debates about the Constitution or pop quizzes about checks and balances. But today, Mr. Whitman had rolled in the TV cart, and not for a movie. On screen, frozen at a single frame, was J.D. Vance, his eyes red, a folded letter resting on the desk in front of him. The silence in the room matched the stillness on screen. Mr. Whitman didn't say much. He just pressed play. The class watched the final minutes of JD's late-night livestream, his voice quiet, his words deliberate. They listened as he read from the veteran in Illyria, heard him say, "Don't shout louder, just keep standing." Saw him pause, saw him choose silence over spectacle. The room stayed silent long after the clip ended. Then a hand went up near the back. It was Daniel, 12 years old, thin, always wearing the same green hoodie no matter the weather. He had barely spoken all semester. "Mr. Whitman," he asked, not loudly but clearly, "is that what courage looks like?" The question floated there, weightless and heavy at the same time. Mr. Whitman looked at Daniel, then looked at the screen, then at the rest of the room. Faces that were used to hearing about courage in the past tense, in textbooks, on Veterans Day, as stories. But this was something else. He didn't answer right away. He reached for the remote, and he hit replay. Again, the clip rolled. Again, JD's voice came through. Again, the letter was read. No background music. No applause. Just a man, a paper, and a country leaning in. And this time, as it played, no one looked at their phones. No one whispered. Even the ones who usually slouch sat up straighter, because there was something in JD's delivery that didn't feel like politics. It felt like a conversation they weren't supposed to hear, but once they did, they couldn't unhear. When the clip ended the second time, Mr. Whitman finally spoke. "Courage," he said slowly, "isn't always a shout. Sometimes it's choosing not to sit down when they tell you you've had your turn." A girl near the window scribbled that line down. Daniel nodded slowly. He didn't raise his hand again. The bell rang 2 minutes later, but no one moved right away. The students filed out more quietly than usual, as if something unspoken had been passed around the room. Not a fact. Not a lesson. Something closer to memory. Mr. Whitman stood at the door as they left, eyes lingering for a moment on the screen, still paused on JD's tired but steady expression. He'd seen many hearings in his life, many speeches, many showdowns. But there was something about this one, about the silence that JD didn't rush to fill, that stayed with him, that reminded him not of a politician, but of a soldier choosing where to stand. And later that evening, after dinner and grading and dishes, he sat back down, opened his laptop, and pressed play again. Just once more. Because courage, he thought, doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it just refuses to go quiet. It was just past 7 a.m. when the voice broke through the static. The host of Morning Circuit, a widely syndicated political radio show, had been recapping the fallout from J.D. Vance's appearance, reading headlines, playing sound bites, opening the phone lines. Most calls followed the usual party lines, each side digging trenches with familiar words. And then came line 4. The voice belonged to a man named Eli Rosner, 71, retired investment manager, longtime Democratic donor, and, as the host quietly informed his producer off-air, a name on the Harris Bundler list 3 cycles in a row. Eli didn't waste time with greetings. "Look," he began, voice gravelly but clear, "I don't agree with J.D. Vance. Not on most things. I've voted blue my entire life. But I watched what happened in that hearing, watched it live, and I'll tell you what bothered me." He paused and then continued. "They didn't challenge him. They tried to erase him. And you don't have to like a man to know that's wrong." The host blinked. "Sir, are you saying—" "I'm saying," Eli interrupted, "that in this country, we don't cut someone's mic because we're uncomfortable. We answer them, or we're cowards." The phone line held. Then the host nodded, slowly, and said, "Thank you, Eli," before moving to the next call. But the damage, or perhaps the healing, had already begun. Within the hour, clips of the call had spread across every major platform. "Former Harris donor defends JD's right to speak" became a headline, then a quote card, then a banner running across cable news. By noon, JD's office inbox, usually filled with partisan noise or invitations to nowhere, was full of something different. Confessions. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of emails from Americans who hadn't voted for him, who had criticized him, dismissed him, mocked him. Now they were writing back, not to convert, but to admit something had shifted. "I didn't like you before, but I watched, and I listened, and I think I was wrong about you. You made me uncomfortable, but not because you were cruel, because you were clear. You reminded me of someone I knew, my father maybe." Some offered stories, some just sent 2 words, "Thank you." Meanwhile, the images began to roll in. Not from D.C., not from campaign rallies, but from the places that rarely made national coverage. In a small bar in Tulsa, the bartender turned the sound up on a flat screen above the taps, playing the clip of J.D. reading the factory worker's letter. The regulars didn't cheer, they just nodded slowly, beers untouched. In a Detroit public high school, a history teacher wheeled in a projector and played the live stream for her seniors. One girl whispered, "He sounds like he's actually talking to someone." At a truck stop diner in Idaho, 3 long-haul drivers watched on a mounted tablet over plastic trays of breakfast. One muttered, "I didn't think people like him made it up there anymore." JD wasn't trending because he was sensational. He was trending because he had refused to flinch, and people saw themselves in that refusal. Back in his office, JD sat at a desk piled with unopened messages. He wasn't smiling, but his face held something firmer, a quiet recognition that the voice he'd fought to keep wasn't his alone anymore. And for every shout in politics that faded into the wind this time, it was the calm that carried. It was just after dusk when J.D. Vance arrived in Toledo, a town blanketed in soft gray light and rusted memory. No cameras followed, no staff, no press vans or scheduled remarks. Just him, walking alone, his collar turned slightly up against the wind and his steps steady across the cracked sidewalk outside an old brick church. The church itself had seen better days, its steeple now leaning slightly, its stained glass windows patched with clear plastic, and its side entrance sticking on the bottom edge. J.D. tugged it open and stepped inside. The basement smelled like old coffee and folded metal chairs. The linoleum was yellowed, the lights overhead flickered slightly, and a bulletin board near the coat rack advertised a chili fundraiser from last spring. But none of that mattered, because sitting in that basement, quietly, patiently, were 11 people, all over the age of 60, some veterans, some widows, some just alone. Most of them had stopped showing up to things years ago, but tonight they had shown up. JD didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, unsure whether to sit or speak. Then from the far corner of the room, a woman stood up slowly. Her cane tapped against the floor as she walked forward, her spine bent, but her gaze unshaken. She wore a purple wool coat, the kind that hadn't changed style since 1963. Her white hair was pulled back into a modest bun, and on her lapel was a faded pin. UAW Local 14. She came to a stop just a few feet in front of him. Then without a word, she lifted her hand and saluted, not sharply, not theatrically, but deeply. JD swallowed. His hands remained at his sides, but his head bowed, not out of performance, but out of instinct. The woman leaned forward slightly. Her voice was soft, cracked, and full of something older than politics. "We thought nobody remembered us." JD looked up slowly. There was no hesitation in his voice when he answered. "I never forgot." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. In that basement, with its folding chairs and flickering lights, something quiet and holy passed between them. Something unrecorded, but deeply felt. She stepped back into her seat. The others remained silent. One man dabbed his eyes with a handkerchief. A younger volunteer, sitting near the coffee pot, sniffed quietly and looked down at his shoes. JD finally spoke. Not as a politician, not even as a senator, but as a man who had walked through too many towns that looked like this one and smelled like this one, and wondered how many people still lived inside their silences. "I came to listen, not to speak. I've done enough of that for now." And he did. For the next hour, he listened to 11 voices. A man who once built train engines until his factory closed in '94. A widow whose son died in Afghanistan while her grocery store closed back home. A retired nurse who said she didn't trust anyone on TV, but you didn't talk like a camera was watching you. When JD finally stood to leave, the woman in the purple coat walked him to the door. "We don't need to agree with everything you say," she told him, "but we know when someone means it." JD smiled gently. "Then we're already better off than most of Washington." As he stepped out into the cold Toledo night, he didn't look back. Because for the first time in a long time, someone had looked at them and stayed. They didn't call it a hearing, not this time. The official agenda listed it as a follow-up session, a soft term to avoid the weight of what had happened just 1 week earlier. But everyone in the building knew what this really was. It was a reckoning in daylight. The invitation had arrived in J.D. Vance's office without warning. A simple email with no pleasantries, no small talk, just a single sentence. "The committee invites you to return to clarify statements presented during your prior testimony." He didn't ask for permission. He didn't bring a team of lawyers or a media crew. He simply said, yes. And now he was back. The committee chamber looked the same, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The lights were brighter, maybe on purpose. The microphones had been tested twice. The nameplates had been realigned. Even the water pitchers looked newly filled, as if someone had scrubbed the last hearing out of the room by force. But the tension couldn't be cleaned away. The air was thick, not loud but pressurized. Along the back walls, reporters stood elbow to elbow, notebooks open, cameras trained. The usual C-SPAN feed wasn't enough this time. 4 different national networks had sent crews, each one hoping to capture not just the words, but the feel of what this day had become. Kamala Harris was already seated when JD arrived. She did not speak. She did not nod. Her posture was perfect, her expression unreadable. But notably, pointedly, she was not seated beside him. Instead, the seat next to JD remained empty for almost a full minute after he arrived, as if the silence of that space needed to say something no one dared to put into words. JD took his place without ceremony. No leather folder this time, no pouch, just a plain manila folder. Closed. He adjusted his mic himself, gently testing it, watching for the red light to blink to life. The chair cleared his throat. This session will resume testimony from Senator Vance in regard to matters raised in the prior hearing. No time limit has been placed on his remarks. That line drew a reaction, not from JD, but from the press. Pens scribbled. Phones buzzed quietly. One reporter mouthed to another. No time limit? JD didn't start right away. He took a breath, scanned the room, and met the eyes of several senators. Some guarded, some curious, a few openly supportive. But he did not look toward Kamala. Not yet. Then he leaned forward and spoke. I appreciate the invitation. Though I didn't ask for it, I accept it fully. His voice was calm but not soft. Steady but with an edge that hinted not at anger, but at resolve sharpened by everything that had happened since. Last week I sat in this room and had my mic cut. Today I've been told that won't happen again. And I believe you. He paused. Not because policy changed, but because the country did. In the second row, a young intern clicked her pen too loudly and drew a brief look from her editor. Everyone returned to stillness. JD continued. So I'm not here to relive what was said. I'm here because a door was opened, and once the people walk through, you can't shut it again. In her seat, Kamala remained silent. But this time, her stillness felt different. Not defensive, not aggressive, just wary. Because for the first time since the beginning, it was clear that this wasn't about JD fighting for a voice anymore. He already had one. Now the question was, what would he use it for next? JD didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace or gesture wildly. He didn't bring charts or slide decks or prepared sound bites. What he brought was time, and the knowledge that this time, no one could take it away. He opened the folder slowly, but didn't glance down at it. A few weeks ago, he began, someone decided my mic wasn't worth keeping on. Maybe they thought the silence would erase the question. Maybe they hoped the echo would die before it reached anyone who mattered. He looked across the room, not just at the senators, but at the cameras, at the people watching, at those who had heard him when official channels tried not to. But something happened in that silence. He paused. You silenced one voice, but you woke up thousands. No one shifted in their seats. No one cleared their throat. Even the aide who usually refilled pitchers stood frozen by the wall, holding a glass in midair, as if any movement might shatter the stillness in the room. JD didn't flinch. A grandmother from East Palestine sent me a note. She'd sold her wedding ring to pay for insulin after her private data was bought and sold by firms protected by laws passed in this very building. A steel worker in Gary wrote me, they closed the plant. They closed the school. Then they tried to close your mouth. His fingers tapped gently on the folder. And a teenager from South Carolina sent me a screenshot of that live stream. Just 3 words under it. He's saying what we lived. He let that sit, then leaned in, not louder, but closer. The thing about trying to control the mic is forgetting that the people never needed one to begin with. They talk at kitchen tables. They talk behind truck stops. They talk when they leave hospitals and can't pay the bill. You don't need a title to tell the truth. Kamala Harris blinked just once. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. She glanced at a paper in front of her, then back up. JD didn't meet her eyes. He wasn't aiming at her anymore. He was speaking beyond her. This isn't about left or right. It's not about scoring points in hearings. It's about dignity, and whether the institutions built to protect it have forgotten the people who built the institutions. Across the aisle, a senator who had never before nodded at JD now gave a barely perceptible incline of the head. JD noticed, but didn't pause. I'm not here to make enemies. I'm not here to win applause. I'm here because if the only thing standing between silence and awareness is one voice, then that voice has a duty, not to shout, but to stand still and keep speaking. He finally opened the folder, pulling out a single page. It was handwritten, faint and weathered. This is from a veteran named Dwight who worked 38 years before losing his pension and his health care in the same month. He wrote, "Don't shout louder, just keep standing." JD folded the paper and placed it back inside. That's all I've tried to do. The room held its breath for another second, then another. He looked toward the chair, nodded once, and clicked off his mic. Not because they made him, because he was finished, and nothing more needed saying. For a full 10 seconds after JD Vance clicked off his mic, no one moved. The air in the chamber had changed, less like a courtroom, more like a chapel. Even the usual buzz of phones or whispering aides had vanished. The silence wasn't awkward. It wasn't forced. It was earned. Across the dais, Kamala Harris sat unmoving. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in defiance, but in calculation. She didn't clap, didn't twitch, didn't blink. Her hands stayed folded in her lap, but her fingers fidgeted almost imperceptibly, thumb against knuckle, as if trying to ground herself against something she hadn't expected. Then softly, like the first drop of rain hitting dry pavement, came a single pair of hands. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't from JD's party. It was a senior senator from Delaware, a man known for towing the middle line with shoes polished down to the leather. He clapped slowly, deliberately, eyes fixed on JD, not seeking permission from anyone else. Another followed, this time, from across the aisle. Then another. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't the kind of applause meant for cameras. It was quiet, human, the kind that said, "We heard you." JD didn't react with a smile, didn't bow or wave. He stood for a moment longer, nodded once toward the chair, not Kamala, not the cameras, and gathered his folder, the same weathered one he brought in. No aides, no talking points. Just a man and the echo of what he'd said. As he stepped away from the table, reporters leaned slightly over the railing, not shouting questions, but watching like something unexplainable had just happened in a place too used to noise. Some lowered their cameras, some didn't. Even the interns, usually quick to glance at their phones, kept their eyes on him. He walked down the center aisle slowly, not dramatic, not reluctant, measured. A few heads turned. One staffer put a hand to her chest. Another whispered, "He did it," though no one responded. Kamala Harris still hadn't moved. Her eyes followed him, but not with fury, with awareness, not just of him, but of what was shifting under her feet. At the exit, JD paused, just once, not to turn back, not to look around, but to listen. The applause had stopped. The silence had returned. But it wasn't empty. It was full of something new, respect. Outside the chamber, the halls remained quiet. No parade, no chants. Just the sound of hard soles on marble, echoing a message that no longer needed a mic to be heard. And in a room built for performance, a man had walked out with something far rarer than victory. He had walked out with credibility. In the far corner of J.D. Vance's Senate office, away from the headlines and handshakes, hangs a frame no bigger than a sheet of paper. It isn't gold. It isn't fancy. It's crafted from weathered walnut, salvaged, not purchased. Inside, resting on black velvet, is the very microphone clipped from his jacket during that first hearing. The cord still twisted, the clip still rusted, but the silence it once symbolized, that part is gone. There's no spotlight on it, no plaque screaming its story, just a single carved line beneath the glass, etched directly into the frame's wood grain. They pulled the cord, so I use my voice. Visitors don't always notice it right away. The room isn't designed to impress. There are no grand portraits, just shelves lined with books and binders. But eventually their eyes find the frame, and when they ask about it, JD never says much. Sometimes he just nods toward it. Sometimes he says, "That day taught me something," and sometimes nothing at all. But those who do know the story, they pause longer. Their gaze lingers, because in that quiet object, cut from sound, yet louder than any speech, lives a moment that couldn't be erased. One staffer once asked why he never upgraded the display. "You could put a plaque under it, or a screen looping the clip," she suggested. JD shook his head. "It doesn't need a second microphone," he said. "Just memory." What began as an act of silencing had become something else. Not rebellion, not revenge, but a reminder that when systems try to mute what matters, the message doesn't disappear. It migrates. And sometimes it ends up hanging on a wall, waiting, not to be admired, but to be remembered. It arrived without fanfare. No return address, no campaign stamp. Just a smudged envelope postmarked Wichita, Kansas, with the handwriting of someone still learning cursive. JD opened it one evening after everyone else had gone home. He had a stack of letters to read, but this one was different. Inside was one sheet of loose-leaf paper, lined, blue ink. No punctuation in places, extra commas in others. It read, "Dear Senator Vance, I watched your speech in civics class. You didn't talk like the other people we watch. You didn't sound mad or fake. You sounded like someone who heard us. Not just us in Kansas. Like us. My dad works at a packing plant. He says the phones listen to him, and people say he's just paranoid. But you talked about that. You said people were being watched who never got a vote. Thank you for talking about people like us. I want to be a lawyer now, or a teacher, or maybe someone who tells the truth even when it's scary. The letter wasn't signed with a full name. Just, Emma, 14, from Kansas, the boring part. JD folded the paper slowly. He didn't file it with the rest. He didn't add it to the archive. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, the same pocket he always used for notes before a hearing. That's where it stayed. Sometimes during long meetings or interviews where the lights felt too bright or the questions too sharp, he'd place a hand over that coat pocket, a small, imperceptible gesture, not out of habit, but anchor. Because Emma, 14, from the boring part of Kansas, had unknowingly become his compass. Not because she agreed with everything, but because she had listened. And more importantly, she had felt heard. In a city full of noise that was the rarest currency of all. The podcast wasn't political. It wasn't combative. It was called Unfiltered Hours. Long-form conversations, sometimes strange, sometimes raw. JD had agreed reluctantly. He liked quiet. He liked letters. But this time, something told him to say yes. The host leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice low. The cameras were rolling, but it felt more like a kitchen table than a broadcast. So let me ask the thing everyone asks, even if they don't say it out loud. JD smiled faintly. He knew what was coming. Was it worth it? The hearing, the fallout, the risk, all of it? JD didn't answer right away. He leaned back, glanced at the mic in front of him. This one not cut, not sabotaged. Just there, waiting. Then after a beat, he looked the host in the eye. You tell me, he said. They cut the mic, but we're still talking, aren't we? Silence again, but not empty. The host nodded, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about something older, something that lived in letters and folded coats and unspoken truths. As the episode drew to a close, a soft piano outro began to play. JD reached for his coat. The letter was still there. Always would be. On screen, one final line appeared. White text on black. Truth doesn't need permission, just someone brave enough to say it out loud. And with that, the screen faded. Not into darkness, but into a quiet that said more than words ever could. This story isn't just about a hearing. It's about what happens when power tries to mute truth, and truth finds another way to be heard. J.D. Vance's journey in this narrative reminds us that courage doesn't always come with volume. Sometimes it comes in the form of quiet conviction, a folded letter, or a moment of pause before answering a hard question. What struck me most was not the exposure of political strategy, but the ripple effect. How one voice, when silenced, awakened thousands more. It's easy to forget in a world of trending noise that integrity is rarely loud. But this story proves that when someone dares to speak for those overlooked, that voice doesn't just echo, it roots itself in memory. In Emma's letter, in the mic on the wall, in the silence that follows real impact. We all have our own microphones, some cut, some still live. The real question is, what truth would you still speak, even if no one handed you the mic? So what about you? Have you ever stayed quiet when you should have spoken? What would you say if the whole world finally leaned in to listen? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.